Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that's going to make your worst Monday morning feel like a spa day. We're talking about why a modern human, you and maybe your father, sitting there in your heated room, probably wearing pajamas at 2 p.m., wouldn't survive even 24 hours in the trenches of World War I. Forget everything Hollywood told you about war being heroic charges and noble sacrifices. This is the real story, and trust me, by the end of this, you'll be kissing your smartphone and thanking whatever deity you believe in that you were born in the era of Netflix and DoorDash instead of poison gas and dysentery. So before you get too comfortable in that gaming chair, hit that like button if you enjoy this kind of deep dive into historical nightmares. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your region. Are you brave enough to watch this at 3 a.m. or are you smart enough to save it for daylight? Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a snack, though fair warning, you might lose your appetite. And let's jump into the most horrifying office job in human history. Picture this. It's November 1916. You're somewhere in France, but somewhere is doing a lot of heavy lifting here because the landscape has been so thoroughly destroyed by artillery that it looks less like Earth and more like the surface of an alien planet that really, really hates tourists. You wake up, and I use that term loosely because you haven't actually slept in the way you understand sleep. What you've done is passed out from exhaustion while sitting upright in a muddy hole. You're back against a wall of sandbags that feel about as comfortable as a brick massage. Chapter 1. Welcome to Hell. Your eyes snap open, and immediately you realize 3 things that would send any modern person into a complete psychological breakdown. First, you can't see your hand in front of your face. Not because it's dark, though it is, but because you're underground in what amounts to a man-made cave system that stretches for hundreds of miles across Europe. The air is thick, humid, and carries the kind of smell that would make a garbage truck driver quit his job. Second, something is crawling on you. Multiple somethings. And before you start thinking, oh, just some bugs, let me stop you right there. These aren't the kind of bugs you'd find in your garden. These are rats the size of cats that have been feasting on, well, let's just say they've been eating a very protein-rich diet, and that protein used to walk on 2 legs. Third, and this is where it gets really fun, you can hear what sounds like the world's worst thunderstorm, except thunderstorms don't usually make the ground shake, like you're living inside a bass drum being played by an angry giant. Welcome to the Western Front, folks. Population, several million people who are all trying to kill each other with industrial-grade efficiency. You try to stand up, because that's what rational modern humans do when they're confused, right? We stand up and assess the situation, except you can't stand up. The trench you're in is only about 6 feet deep, and you're not alone. You're packed in with 30 other guys in a space designed for maybe 15, and everyone smells like they haven't showered since the Ottoman Empire was still a thing. Oh, and speaking of smell, take a deep breath. Actually, don't. Please don't. The air in a WWI trench was a bouquet of human misery that would make a skunk apologize. You've got the obvious suspects. Human waste, because guess what? There's no bathroom down here. There's unwashed bodies, because the nearest shower is probably in Paris, and Paris might as well be on Mars. But then you've got the special ingredients that really make this place memorable. Rotting food, wet wool that's been wet for 6 months straight, the sweet sick smell of gangrene, and what the soldiers politely called the smell of the dead, which is exactly what it sounds like and 10 times worse than you're imagining. Now, before we continue, I want you to pause this video for just a second. Go to your bathroom, look at your toilet, look at your shower, look at your medicine cabinet full of antibiotics and antiseptics. Say thank you to your toilet. I'm serious. Say it out loud. Because where we're going, there are no toilets, and the toilet paper is whatever you can scrounge from the mail that might not make it home anyway. You're starting to panic, which, honestly, is the appropriate response. Your modern brain is trying to process this situation, but it's like trying to run Cyberpunk 2077 on a calculator from 1987. It just doesn't compute. See, your brain has been trained by a lifetime of problems that have solutions. Phone battery dead, charge it. Hungry, DoorDash, sick, WebMD, then panic, then actual doctor. Your entire existence has been built around the assumption that problems are temporary and fixable. But this is a problem that's been going on for 3 years already, with no end in sight, and the only solutions anyone has come up with so far involve different ways of making the problem worse. You try to pull out your phone. Muscle memory, right? Where is it? Oh, right, it's 1916. The closest thing to a smartphone is a telegraph, and the telegraph operator probably got blown up yesterday. Chapter 2. Breakfast is served, and you won't want seconds. Just when you think this can't get worse, someone taps you on the shoulder. It's a guy who looks like he's aged 30 years in the past 30 weeks. His uniform is less uniform and more collection of fabric scraps, held together by mud and optimism. New fish? He asks, and his accent tells you he's probably from somewhere in rural England, though his voice sounds like he's been gargling gravel. You nod, because what else are you going to do? Tell him you're actually a time traveler from the future who's here to do research for a YouTube video. He'd probably believe you. Stranger things have happened in this war. Right then, he says, breakfast? Now, when he says breakfast, your modern brain immediately starts conjuring images. Maybe some eggs Benedict, avocado toast. At minimum, some Cheerios and milk that hasn't expired. What you get instead is a tin cup filled with something that might technically qualify as coffee, if coffee could be made from dirt and regret. The breakfast is a chunk of bread that has the consistency of a hockey puck and tastes like it was baked sometime during the Renaissance, along with a tin of something called bully beef, which sounds fun until you realize it's just corned beef that's been sitting in a can so long it's achieved sentience. Oh, and you eat this while standing in mud up to your ankles, using your fingers, because forks are for peacetime and civilians. The coffee, and I'm using that term very generously, tastes like someone dissolved a cigarette butt in hot water and then added a hint of diesel fuel for flavor. But here's the thing. You drink it anyway. You drink it because it's warm, and warm is precious when you're living in conditions that would make a medieval peasant write a complaint letter. The bread requires actual effort to chew. This isn't the soft, fluffy bread you're used to. This is bread that could double as a weapon. Soldiers sometimes called it army biscuit, but calling it a biscuit is like calling a brick a pillow, technically true in the most generous interpretation, but missing the point entirely. And the bully beef? Imagine cat food, but made for humans who have no choice and no alternatives. It's protein, technically. And at this point, technically protein is as good as it gets. Let me put this in perspective for you. This morning, before you clicked on this video, you probably had more food options for breakfast than a WWI soldier had in an entire month. You could have had cereal, toast, eggs, yogurt, fruit, or any combination thereof. You probably had access to clean water from a tap, and if that water tasted bad, you would have complained about it. These guys are eating bread that could be used as armor plating and drinking coffee that would fail a health inspection in every country on Earth, and they're grateful for it. Chapter 3, The Commute from Hell. After this culinary experience, your new best friend, let's call him Tommy, because everyone in the British Army was apparently named Tommy, tells you it's time for stand 2. Stand to what, you ask, which makes Tommy laugh. It's not a happy laugh. It's the laugh of someone who's seen things that would make a horror movie director change careers. Stand to, mate. Morning routine. Jerry likes to attack at dawn, so we all stand up and pretend we're ready for it. Jerry, you learn, is what they call the Germans. Not because all Germans are named Jerry, but because, well, honestly, nobody seems to know why. War nicknames are weird like that. So you stand ups, which is when you discover the first of many ways your modern body is completely unprepared for this experience. Your back is absolutely destroyed. See, you've spent your entire life sleeping on mattresses. Good mattresses. Mattresses with springs and memory foam and thread counts that cost more than these soldiers made in a year. You've slept on pillows designed by scientists to optimize your spinal alignment. You've just spent the night sleeping on what amounts to a wooden board covered by a blanket that's thinner than most bath towels, and your spine is sending your brain strongly worded complaints that would make a Karen's Yelp review look polite. But you stand up anyway, because apparently not standing up means you might get shot, and getting shot is generally considered worse than back pain. Tommy hands you something that looks like a submarine periscope made by someone who flunked out of engineering school. Take a look, he says. You peer through this contraption and see nothing, just more mud. Brown, churned up earth that stretches to the horizon like God spilled chocolate milk on the entire continent and then forgot to clean it up. Where's the enemy, you ask? Tommy points. About 100 yards that way, behind that pile of mud that looks exactly like our pile of mud. Oinks! This is when it hits you. This entire war is basically two groups of people hiding in mud holes, occasionally popping up to shoot at each other, like the world's deadliest game of whack-a-mole. The strategic complexity that took generals years to plan amounts to dig hole, sit in hole, shoot at other people's holes. To Chapter 4, Mail Call, when good news is rare. Around mid-morning, assuming you can tell time without a sun that's been blocked by smoke and clouds for the better part of 3 years, there's mail call. In your time, mail is mostly bills and packages from Amazon. Here, mail is the difference between sanity and complete psychological collapse. Letters from home are more valuable than food, more precious than clean water, and more desperately needed than ammunition. Tommy gets a letter from his sweetheart back in Yorkshire. You can tell because his entire face changes when he sees the handwriting. For just a moment, he doesn't look like someone who's been living in a hole in the ground, eating prison food and listening to explosions. He looks almost human again. He reads it quietly, and you can see him mouthing the words, like he's trying to remember what normal life feels like. The letter probably talks about everyday things, what her sister is doing, how the weather's been, maybe some local gossip about Mrs. Henderson's new hat. To you, this would be boring small talk. To Tommy, it's a lifeline to a world where people worry about normal things instead of whether they'll still have all their limbs tomorrow. You don't get any mail, obviously, because everyone you know won't be born for another 70 years. But watching Tommy read his letter makes you realize something. In your time, you're connected to everyone all the time. You can text anyone, call anyone, video chat with someone on the other side of the planet while sitting on your toilet. These guys get maybe one letter a week if they're lucky, and it took 2 weeks to get here, and there's no guarantee the person who wrote it is still alive. Real quick, let me ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. When's the last time you went more than 2 hours without checking your phone? Not because you were asleep, but just didn't check it? I'll wait. Yeah, that's what I thought. Now imagine going 2 weeks without any contact with anyone you care about, not knowing if they're okay, not knowing if they even know you're alive. Chapter 5, the hygiene horror show. After mail call, Tommy suggests you get cleaned up. This is hilarious for several reasons. The main one being that clean is a relative concept when you're living in a mud hole with 30 other unwashed humans. Where's the bathroom, you ask, which makes Tommy laugh again. This is becoming a pattern. Bathroom, he says. You mean the latrine? He points to what looks like a wooden box built over a pit. There's no door, no privacy, no toilet paper, and definitely no Febreze. This is where 30 men handle their daily business. And handle is being very generous. The smell hits you from 20 feet away, and it's so bad that your modern stomach, which has never processed anything worse than day-old pizza, immediately starts staging a revolt. But here's the thing, you have to use it anyway. Because when nature calls, and nature doesn't care that you're used to bathrooms with automatic flush sensors and heated toilet seats. Using a WWI latrine is like using a porta-potty that's been sitting in the sun for 6 months. Except it's below ground. It's never been cleaned, and there's a good chance someone's going to start shooting at you while you're using it. Privacy? That's a luxury for people who aren't at war. Toilet paper? You're lucky if you can find a piece of newspaper that isn't needed for something more important, like starting a fire or wrapping food. After that traumatic experience, it's time to wash up, which involves a basin of water that looks like it was last changed during the Napoleonic Wars. Multiple people have used this water already, and you can see evidence of their visits floating on the surface. You're supposed to wash your face, hands, and whatever other body parts you can manage with this water and a bar of soap that has the cleaning power of a small pebble. The soap is brown, though whether it started that way or achieved brownness through use is unclear. Your modern skin, which is used to pH-balanced cleansers and moisturizers with names like Ultra Hydrating Renewal Complex, is about to encounter soap made from animal fat and lye. It's going to strip away every natural oil your skin has ever produced and leave you feeling like you just washed with sandpaper. But you wash anyway, because not washing isn't really an option when you're living this close to other people. The smell of 30 unwashed men in a confined space is something that would make a septic tank apologize. Chapter 6, Fashion Week, your WWI wardrobe. Speaking of hygiene, let's talk about your outfit, because your modern fashion sense is about to meet industrial-era practicality, and it's not going to be pretty. Your uniform consists of several layers, each one more uncomfortable than the last. First, there's a wool shirt that feels like it was made from sheep that died angry. Wool in 1916 wasn't the soft, treated wool you might wear in a modern sweater. This is wool in its natural state, scratchy, itchy, and absorbent in all the wrong ways. Over that, you've got a wool tunic that's about as flattering as a burlap sack and twice as uncomfortable. The wool isn't just rough, it's also a moisture trap. Any sweat, rain, or other moisture gets absorbed and just stays there forever. Then there are the trousers, which are made of the same delightful wool and cut in a style that suggests the designer had never actually seen human legs before. They're too long, too narrow, and they chafe in places you didn't know could chafe. Your boots, oh, your poor modern feet. You're used to athletic shoes designed by scientists to optimize comfort and performance. These boots are made of leather that's so hard it could stop a bullet, and they're designed with one goal in mind, not falling apart immediately. Comfort wasn't even a consideration. These boots will give you blisters on your blisters, and by day 3, walking will feel like participating in a marathon across broken glass. But wait, there's more. You also get to carry around about 60 pounds of equipment. Your rifle weighs 10 pounds and is longer than you're tall. You've got ammunition, a gas mask, a helmet that's about as protective as a salad bowl, a pack full of supplies, and various tools for digging trenches and fixing things. Remember, you're carrying all this while wearing those fantastic wool clothes and walking in those delightful boots through mud that's often knee-deep for distances that would make a modern marathon runner quit and become an accountant. Your modern body, which gets tired walking from the couch to the refrigerator, is about to discover what physical labor actually means. Chapter 7, the gas mask introduction. Breathing is overrated. Around noon, someone yells, "Gas!" and suddenly everyone is moving faster than you've seen them move all day. Tommy grabs your arm and shoves something over your face. It's your gas mask, and it's about as comfortable as breathing through a sweaty sock while wearing swim goggles that don't fit. The mask is made of canvas and rubber, and it smells like chemicals and fear. The eyepieces fog up immediately so you can't see anything, and the breathing apparatus makes every breath feel like you're sucking air through a straw. But here's the terrifying part. This mask is literally the only thing standing between you and a horrible death by poison gas. See, in your time when someone says toxic environment, they're probably talking about a bad workplace or a dysfunctional relationship. Here, toxic environment means the air itself is trying to kill you with chemical weapons that would be considered war crimes. If this war wasn't the war that made us decide some things should be war crimes. The gas they're using isn't just unpleasant, it's specifically designed to cause maximum suffering. Chlorine gas burns your lungs from the inside out. Phosgene gas tricks you into thinking you're okay, then kills you 12 hours later when your lungs fill with fluid. Mustard gas burns your skin, blinds you, and destroys your respiratory system all at the same time. And you have to trust that this canvas and rubber mask, which was made by the lowest bidder and hasn't been properly maintained in months, is going to save your life. You try to breathe normally, but normal breathing through a gas mask feels like drowning in reverse. Every breath is work. Every breath requires conscious effort. And you have to keep this thing on for however long the gas attack lasts, which could be minutes or hours. Your modern lungs, which have never had to work harder than climbing 2 flights of stairs, are suddenly working overtime just to get enough oxygen to keep you conscious. But the physical discomfort isn't even the worst part. The worst part is the psychological terror of knowing that invisible death is floating around you, and your only protection is a piece of equipment you wouldn't trust to keep water out of your basement. You can't see clearly through the fog lenses. You can't breathe normally. You can't talk. You're essentially blind, deaf, and mute, trapped inside your own personal nightmare while death drifts past you like a gentle breeze. And everyone around you is in the same situation. 30 men, all trapped in their own masks, all wondering if this is the moment their equipment fails, all trying to breathe through canvas while their hearts pound with panic. This lasts for 45 minutes. When it's finally over, and you can remove the mask, the relief is so intense you almost cry. Almost, because crying uses moisture you can't afford to lose, and you're already dehydrated from sweating inside a wool uniform while wearing a rubber mask. Let me just pause here for a second to point out that we've been in this trench for maybe 6 hours, and we've already covered waking up in filth, eating inedible food, using facilities that violate the Geneva Convention, wearing clothes designed by sadists, and nearly dying from poison gas. And this is just Tuesday. There are people who did this for 4 years. Chapter 8. Lunch break, because someone has a sense of humor. After the gas attack, it's time for lunch because apparently the war stops for meal breaks. This is actually true. There were informal truces for certain activities like collecting the wounded, or in this case, eating whatever passes for food. Lunch is more of the same. Bread that could double as a weapon, some kind of soup that might contain vegetables if you're very generous with your definition of vegetables, and more of that coffee substitute that tastes like it was made from dirt and despair. You eat this while sitting on a wooden crate, surrounded by men who look like extras from a zombie movie, and you're grateful for it. Not because it's good, it's objectively terrible, but because it's food, and food means you're still alive. This is when you start to understand something that no amount of historical research could have prepared you for: the complete recalibration of what constitutes good. In your world, good food means it tastes good. Here, good food means it doesn't make you sick and provides enough calories to keep you moving. The bar for good has been lowered so far it's basically underground. While you're eating lunch, someone starts singing. It's not a particularly good song, something about missing home and hating the war, but everyone joins in anyway. Not because they're particularly musical, but because singing is something normal people do. And reminding yourself that you're still a normal person is important. Your generation expresses itself through social media posts and carefully curated Instagram stories. These guys express themselves through songs that would make a folk musician weep, not for their beauty, but for their raw honesty about the absolute misery of their situation. One of the verses goes something like, "We're here because we're here because we're here because we're here," which is either profound commentary on the absurdity of war or evidence that prolonged exposure to artillery fire affects songwriting ability. Either way, you find yourself humming along because even terrible music is better than the constant sound of distant explosions and dying men. Chapter 9. Afternoon activities. The world's worst summer camp. After lunch, it's time for what Tommy cheerfully calls trench maintenance, which sounds like something you'd hire a professional to do, but turns out to be something you do yourself with hand tools that were outdated when your great-grandfather was young. Trench maintenance involves several delightful activities. First, there's draining, which means using buckets to remove the water that constantly seeps into the trench from above and below. This water isn't clean rainwater. It's a mixture of mud, human waste, rotting organic matter, and whatever chemicals have been soaking into the soil for the past 3 years. You're essentially working with liquid sewage, using your bare hands, and there's no hand sanitizer or even soap at the end of it. Then there's revetment repair, which is a fancy way of saying fixing the walls so they don't collapse and bury everyone alive. The walls of the trench are held up by wooden boards, sandbags, and optimism, and all three require constant maintenance. The wooden boards are rotting because they've been sitting in mud for months. The sandbags are torn because they've been shot at by people who don't want you to have nice things. And the optimism is wearing thin because, well, look around. You fix these walls using tools that your grandfather would have recognized. Hammers, nails, saws, and pure determination. There are no power tools, no level to make sure things are straight, and definitely no safety equipment. You hit your thumb with a hammer approximately 17 times in the first hour, and each time you swear creatively enough to make Tommy nod in approval. The most popular activity is sandbag duty, which sounds simple until you realize that sandbags in 1916 weigh about 60 pounds each and need to be moved from one place to another place. That's exactly as terrible as the first place. You lift these sandbags using muscles you didn't know you had, and by the end of the first hour you discover muscles you wish you didn't have, because they hurt in ways your gym membership never prepared you for. Modern exercise is designed to build muscle efficiently while minimizing injury. This is just moving heavy things because heavy things need to be somewhere else, and physics doesn't care about your comfort level. Your back, which was already complaining from sleeping on wood, is now filing formal complaints that would make a union organizer proud. Chapter 10. The medical tent where optimism goes to die. Around 3 in the afternoon, Tommy suggests you visit the medical officer to get your hands looked at, because apparently hitting yourself with a hammer 17 times requires professional attention. The medical tent is exactly as cheerful as you'd expect from a place where they practice medicine with equipment that wouldn't pass a health inspection at a veterinary clinic. The doctor, and I use that term loosely, is a guy who looks like he learned medicine from a correspondence course and has been practicing on unwilling volunteers ever since. He's got blood on his apron, dirt under his fingernails, and the kind of smile that says, "This is going to hurt you more than it hurts me." He examines your hands with the gentleness of someone checking a car engine, announces that you have minor abrasions, and proceeds to treat them with alcohol that's strong enough to run a car engine. The pain is so intense that you see stars, not the good kind of stars you see in romantic movies. These are the stars you see when your nervous system decides to file a complaint directly with your brain's management department. The medical supplies are about what you'd expect from an era when people thought smoking was good for you and cocaine was medicine. Bandages are reused until they fall apart. Antiseptic is whatever alcohol they can find. Pain medication is aspirin if you're lucky, and bite down on this stick if you're not. Your modern medical expectations are completely useless here. You're used to sterile environments, single-use supplies, and medications that are specifically designed to treat your exact problem. Here, medicine is, this probably won't kill you faster than the thing we're treating. The doctor wraps your hands in bandages that look like they've been used before, possibly multiple times, and tells you to keep them dry, which is advice that's about as useful as telling someone in a hurricane to try not to get wet. Chapter 11. Letter writing. Creative truth telling. After your medical adventure, Tommy suggests you write a letter home. This presents a unique problem since everyone you know lives in the future, but you decide to play along. Letter writing in a WWI trench is an exercise in creative truth telling. You can't tell your family how bad things really are, partly because censors will read your mail and delete anything too honest, but mostly because the truth would drive your loved ones completely insane. So instead of writing, "Dear Mom, I'm living in a hole in the ground, eating food that would be rejected by prisoners, and people are trying to kill me with poison gas," you write something like, "Dear Mom, things are going well here, the food isn't too bad, and we're all in good spirits." This is lying, but it's lying with compassion. The truth would serve no purpose except to make people worry about things they can't control. You watch the other men writing their letters, and they all have the same concentrated expression of people trying to describe paradise while living in purgatory. They write about how much they miss home, but they don't write about why they miss it. They write about looking forward to coming home, but they don't write about whether they think that will actually happen. Every letter gets read by an officer whose job is to make sure you don't accidentally give away military secrets or destroy civilian morale. This means you have to write with the assumption that everything you say will be judged by someone whose main qualification for the job is that he went to the right school. Want to mention that it's been raining for 6 weeks straight? That's weather information that could help the enemy. Want to say that the food is terrible? That's complaining about military supplies, which is bad for morale. Want to mention that your unit took heavy casualties last week? That's classified military information. So you end up writing letters that sound like they were composed by a cheerful robot. The weather has been variable. The food is adequate. The men are in good spirits. Your generation overshares everything on social media, posting pictures of your lunch and broadcasting your feelings in real time. These guys can't even tell their mothers that they're scared without risking censorship. Chapter 12. Dinner time. The sequel nobody asked for. As the sun starts to set, not that you can see the sun through the smoke and clouds, it's time for dinner, which is exactly as exciting as breakfast and lunch combined. The menu consists of the same bread, now somehow even harder, some kind of stew that contains ingredients you don't want to identify, and tea that tastes like it was made by someone who had heard a description of tea but had never actually tasted it. You eat this meal while standing in mud, using utensils that have been cleaned with the same questionable water you washed your face with, and you're grateful for it because the alternative is starvation. This is when you start to understand the psychological impact of constant low-level misery. It's not just that everything is bad, it's that everything is bad all the time, and there's no relief, no break, no moment when you can say, well, at least this is nice. Your modern life is full of small pleasures, a good cup of coffee, a comfortable chair, a funny video on your phone. Here, pleasure is the absence of immediate pain, and comfort is whatever doesn't make things actively worse. After dinner, there's what passes for entertainment in the trenches. Someone has a harmonica that sounds like it's dying a slow death. Someone else has a deck of cards that's so worn down the suits are more suggestion than reality. A few guys huddle around a letter from home sharing news from a world that feels increasingly fictional. This is their Netflix, their internet, their entire entertainment industry rolled into one. Whatever they can create or share with the materials at hand. You think about your entertainment options at home, streaming services with millions of hours of content, video games with graphics that look more real than reality, social media platforms that provide endless distraction. These guys have a harmonica and some stories about home, and they treat it like it's the best entertainment in the world. Chapter 13, The Night Shift, when things get really interesting. As darkness falls, and by darkness I mean the kind of complete, absolute darkness that city dwellers never experience, the trench comes alive in ways that would make your modern anxiety disorders require their own anxiety disorders. Night is when the real work happens in the trenches, because daytime movement draws sniper fire, and nobody wants to be the guy who got shot because he needed to use the bathroom during business hours. Tommy hands you what he calls a rifle, though calling it a rifle is like calling a horse and buggy a vehicle. Technically accurate, but missing the point. This rifle is longer than you are tall, weighs about as much as a small child, and fires bullets that could punch through a car engine. Ever fired one of these? Tommy asks. You want to say, I've played Call of Duty, but you suspect that's not going to be helpful here, so you just shake your head. Tommy gives you a 5-minute crash course in operating a weapon designed to kill people efficiently. This is not like learning to use modern firearms, which are designed with user-friendly features and safety mechanisms. This rifle operates on the principle of point it at things you want to make dead and pull this thing here. The safety mechanism is don't pull the trigger unless you want to shoot something. And the user interface is everything is your responsibility, don't screw up. You hold this weapon and realize you're now technically a soldier in the most devastating war in human history up to that point. And your training consists of, Tommy said, to point it that way. But shooting the rifle is the easy part. The hard part is something called night patrol, which is exactly what it sounds like and 10 times more terrifying than you're imagining. Night patrol means leaving the relative safety of the trench and crawling out into no man's land to gather intelligence, repair wire, or just generally do things that make you an easy target for anyone with a rifle and decent night vision. No man's land is the area between the two sets of trenches, and it's called no man's land. Because going there is a great way to stop being a man, or anything else, really. It's maybe 100 yards of churned up earth, shell craters, barbed wire, and the occasional corpse of someone who thought they were clever enough to cross it. Your mission tonight is to crawl out there, check on the barbed wire barriers, and crawl back without getting shot, blown up, or lost in the maze of craters and abandoned equipment that litter the landscape like the world's most dangerous obstacle course. Crawling through no man's land is like playing the world's deadliest game of hide and seek, except the people seeking you have machine guns and a very liberal interpretation of the rules. You army crawl on your belly through mud that's been mixed with 3 years' worth of human misery. Your modern body, which considers a flight of stairs to be serious exercise, is now dragging itself across broken ground while carrying 60 pounds of equipment and trying not to make any sound that might attract attention. The mud isn't just wet dirt, it's a mixture of soil, rainwater, human waste, rotting organic matter, and chemicals that have been soaking into the ground since this war started. You're essentially swimming through liquid history, and that history smells like death and despair. Every few feet, you have to stop and listen. Not for your favorite podcast or the notification sound on your phone, but for the sound of someone trying to kill you. Machine gun fire sounds different when it's aimed at you, less like the dramatic sound effects in movies and more like someone very angrily trying to solve a problem. And the problem is your continued existence. When you finally reach the wire barriers, you discover that barbed wire is a quaint description for what amounts to an industrial-grade nightmare designed by someone who really, really wanted to make sure nobody had a good time crossing this field. This isn't the decorative barbed wire you might see on a farm fence. This is military-grade wire with barbs that are designed to grab onto anything that touches them and not let go. The wire is arranged in complex patterns that would challenge a professional maze designer, and it's all designed with one goal: to slow down anyone trying to cross it long enough for someone to shoot them. You have to check this wire for breaks or weak spots, which means crawling through it while trying not to get caught, cut, or tangled up like a Christmas present wrapped by someone having a nervous breakdown. Your modern clothes, well, your 1916 wool uniform, catches on every barb. The wire grabs your sleeves, your pants, your equipment, and occasionally your skin, which it treats with all the gentleness of an angry porcupine. While you're doing this, you can hear the sounds of the war continuing around you. Artillery shells whistle overhead like express trains driven by people who failed geometry. Machine guns chatter in the distance like typewriters operated by very fast, very angry secretaries. Occasionally, you hear something that stops your heart. Footsteps. Someone else is out here in no man's land, and they're probably not here to help you with your wire inspection project. You freeze, which is easy because terror has a way of making your muscles forget how to work. You lie perfectly still in the mud, breathing as quietly as possible while your heart pounds so loud you're sure it can be heard in Berlin. The footsteps get closer, closer, and then they stop. For what feels like 17 hours, but is probably 30 seconds, you lie there wondering if this is how you die. Face down in French mud, wearing someone else's uniform, checking wire barriers for an army you never volunteered to join. Then the footsteps move away, and you remember how to breathe again. Chapter 14, The Return Journey, Getting Home the Hard Way. After what feels like a lifetime, but was probably only 2 hours, you finish checking the wire and begin the journey back to your trench. This should be easier, since you're going back to a place you know, except that everything looks different in the dark. And different, in no man's land, usually means more dangerous. The shell craters that were easy to navigate around on the way out have somehow multiplied and rearranged themselves. The landmarks you used to navigate, that blown-up tree, that pile of rubble that might have been a building once, all look the same in the darkness. You're essentially trying to navigate using a GPS that consists of that shadowy thing over there might be the thing I remember from 2 hours ago. Well, at some point, you realize you might be lost, which in no man's land is like realizing you might be dead. Being lost here doesn't mean you'll miss your dinner reservation. It means you might crawl straight into enemy lines and become a very surprised prisoner of war, assuming they're in a prisoner-taking mood. You lie still and try to figure out where you are using the advanced navigation techniques they don't teach in modern GPS systems, listening for the sound of your own army and hoping it's closer than the sound of the other army. The problem is that armies at night sound pretty much the same. A lot of quiet talking, some coughing, the occasional clank of metal equipment. Your ability to distinguish between your guys and their guys based on audio alone is about as reliable as weather forecasting based on how your joints feel. Eventually, through a combination of luck, stubbornness, and the kind of determination that comes from really not wanting to die in a foreign country, you find what you think might be your trench. The challenge now is getting back into your own trench without being shot by your own side, because soldiers in wartime are understandably suspicious of anything that moves at night. Your password for the evening is some phrase in English that you're supposed to whisper to the sentries so they know you're friendly. The problem is that whispering a password while lying face down in mud, after crawling through no man's land for 3 hours, while scared out of your mind, results in communication that sounds less like English and more like someone trying to speak while drowning. "Halt! Who goes there?" comes a voice from the trench. You try to whisper the password, but it comes out as something that sounds like Merle Burr Fredlumph. "What?" says the voice, and you can hear the sound of a rifle being pointed in your direction. You try again, putting all your effort into clear pronunciation. "Leicester? Square? Tommy sent me." There's a pause that lasts approximately forever, and then, "Right then, come on in, but move slow like." Chapter 15. Debriefing. What fresh hell is this? You crawl into the trench with all the grace of a drunk penguin, and immediately several things become clear. First, you smell terrible. Not just regular terrible, but terrible in ways that would make a garbage truck back away slowly. You smell like mud, fear, rotting vegetation, and that special aroma that comes from crawling through a battlefield for 3 hours. Second, you're shaking. Not because you're cold, though you are cold, but because your nervous system has just processed the fact that you spent 3 hours in a place where people were actively trying to kill you, and it's having some opinions about that experience. Third, you're different. Something fundamental has changed in the past few hours. You've crossed a line that separates people who have been shot at from people who haven't, and there's no crossing back. Tommy takes one look at you and nods knowingly. "How was your first time in no man's land?" he asks. and his tone suggests he already knows the answer. Terrible, you manage to say, which makes him laugh. Good, he says. If you enjoyed it, we'd have to worry about you. He hands you something that might technically be tea, though it tastes like someone dissolved a boot in hot water and added optimism. You drink it anyway because it's warm, and warm is precious when you're covered in mud and existential dread. Wire's all good, you report, because apparently that's what you say when you come back from these missions. Right, says Tommy. Tomorrow night, we'll check the other section. Tomorrow night. You realize this isn't a one-time experience. This is your job now. Every night, someone has to crawl out into no man's land and check things, repair things, or gather information about things. And tonight, you learned that someone is you. Chapter 16. Attempting sleep, the world's worst hotel. After your night patrol adventure, it's time for what the Army optimistically calls sleep. Though calling it sleep is like calling a car crash a transportation event. Technically accurate, but missing most of the story. Your bed is the same wooden plank you slept on last night, except now you're covered in mud, wire scratches, and the kind of fatigue that comes from 3 hours of crawling through a nightmare while people try to kill you. You lie down on this plank, pull your single blanket over yourself, and try to convince your brain that it's time to rest. Your brain, however, has some thoughts about this plan. Your modern brain is used to processing stress through Netflix binges, social media scrolling, or complaining to friends via text message. None of these options are available, so instead, your brain decides to process the day's events through the tried and true method of replaying every terrifying moment in vivid detail. Remember when you heard those footsteps in no man's land? Your brain wants to examine that memory from every possible angle. What if those footsteps belong to someone with a bayonet? What if they saw you and are planning something for tomorrow night? What if they're out there right now planning an attack? Remember when you couldn't find the trench on the way back? Your brain would like to explore all the ways that could have gone wrong. What if you had crawled into enemy lines? What if you had gotten lost and wandered around until dawn when snipers could see you? What if, while your brain is running this horror movie marathon, the war is providing the soundtrack? Artillery shells continue to whistle overhead all night, because apparently the war doesn't believe in business hours. Each whistle makes you wonder if this is the one that's going to land in your trench, turning your sleeping arrangement into a crater. Machine gun fire chatters in the distance like deadly rain, and occasionally you can hear the sound of men shouting, though whether they're your men or their men, and whether they're shouting orders or just shouting because they're dying, is impossible to tell from this distance. Every hour or so, there's the sound of an attack happening somewhere along the line. Not here, thank God, but close enough that you can hear it. The sound of men running, shooting, screaming, and dying while you lie on a wooden plank pretending to sleep. Meanwhile, the 30 other men in your section are attempting sleep with varying degrees of success. Some of them snore with the volume and enthusiasm of industrial machinery. Others talk in their sleep, having conversations with people who are either back home or dead, and sometimes it's hard to tell which. One guy near you keeps whimpering like a wounded animal. Another keeps mumbling what sounds like prayers in a language you don't recognize. Someone else grinds their teeth so loudly it sounds like he's trying to mill flour with his jaw. This is your lullaby: snoring, sleep-talking, night terrors, and the distant sound of industrial-scale violence, all accompanied by the gentle patter of rats running across your legs. Chapter 17. The morning after. Groundhog Day in Hell. You wake up, and again, wake up is generous because you never really slept, to discover that everything is exactly the same as yesterday, except worse. Your body hurts in new and creative ways. The crawling expedition has introduced your muscles to types of pain that your gym membership never warned you about. Your hands are still torn up from the wire, your back has filed formal complaints about the sleeping arrangements, and your legs feel like someone spent the night beating them with hammers. But here's the thing that really starts to mess with your mind. It's the same routine as yesterday. Same terrible coffee, same inedible bread, same standard routine, same mail call where you don't get any mail, same trench maintenance, same everything. In your modern life, every day is different. Different tasks at work, different shows to watch, different social media posts to scroll through. Your brain is used to novelty, variety, stimulation. Here, every day is exactly the same, except for the creative ways people try to kill you. This is when you start to understand something that historians call trench warfare psychology, but which is really just what happens when you put human beings in an impossible situation and leave them there for years. The routine isn't just about military efficiency, it's about psychological survival. When your world has been reduced to a hole in the ground and your future has been reduced to maybe I'll survive today, routine becomes the thing that keeps your mind from completely snapping. You do the same things at the same time every day because having a schedule, even a terrible schedule, gives your brain something to hold on to. It's the difference between I'm trapped in hell and I'm trapped in hell, but at least I know what comes next. During mail call, you watch the other men receive their letters and you start to notice something. The guys who get mail regularly seem to be handling this better than the guys who don't. Not because they're tougher or braver, but because they still have a connection to the world that makes sense. Letters aren't just communication, they're proof that somewhere there's still a world where people worry about normal things, where someone's biggest concern is whether Mrs. Henderson's new hat is too expensive, or whether Cousin Billy passed his exams, or whether the weather will be good for the church picnic. These letters are like postcards from sanity, and reading them is the closest these men get to remembering what it feels like to be human, instead of just another piece of military equipment. Chapter 18, The Injury Report, When Your Body Starts Giving Up. By your third day in the trenches, your modern body is starting to file formal complaints that would make a personal injury lawyer salivate. Your feet, which have never experienced anything worse than a long day at the mall, are now dealing with what the Army calls trench foot. This isn't just having cold, wet feet. This is a medical condition where your feet essentially start rotting while you're still wearing them. The constant moisture, combined with the lack of ability to change socks or dry your feet, creates an environment where bacteria throw a party that your feet weren't invited to. Your feet swell up, turn colors that feet shouldn't turn, and develop a smell that would make a skunk apologize. Your digestive system, which is used to process foods designed to be easy on your stomach, is staging a revolt that would make the French Revolution look like a polite disagreement. The combination of terrible food, contaminated water, stress, and living in conditions that would fail a health inspection at a gas station bathroom has turned your digestive system into a battlefield where nothing good happens and everything hurts. You're alternating between constipation that could be used as a form of medieval torture and diarrhea that strikes with the timing and intensity of artillery bombardments. There's no comfortable middle ground, no normal digestive function, just alternating between two different types of misery. Your skin, which has never experienced anything worse than the occasional sunburn, is now dealing with what amounts to a full-scale invasion by every form of bacteria, fungus, and parasite that Europe has to offer. You've got rashes in places you didn't know could get rashes. You've got infections that would require antibiotics that won't be invented for another 30 years. You've got cuts and scratches that refuse to heal because your body doesn't have the resources to heal them properly. And then there are the lice. Lice in WWI trenches weren't just an inconvenience. They were a full-time roommate situation with insects that treated your body like an all-you-can-eat buffet. These aren't the head lice that modern parents worry about when their kids come home from school. These are body lice that live in your clothes, bite you constantly, and reproduce faster than rabbits with a caffeine addiction. You can't get rid of them because getting rid of them would require washing your clothes in hot water and having clean clothes to change into, neither of which are available. So you live with them, and they live off you, in a relationship that's beneficial to exactly nobody except the lice. The itching is constant, maddening, and impossible to satisfy. You scratch until you bleed, which just creates new places for the lice to bite, which makes you itch more, which makes you scratch more, in a cycle that would be funny if it wasn't happening to you. Chapter 19, The Psychological Breakdown. When your mind joins the rebellion. By the end of your first week, your modern psychology is starting to crack like a smartphone screen dropped on concrete. Your brain, which is used to managing stress through controllable challenges, deadlines at work, traffic jams, social media drama, is now trying to process a situation where death is random, constant, and completely outside your control. This is when you start to understand what historians politely call shell shock, but which is really just what happens when you put a human brain in a situation that human brains weren't designed to handle. You haven't had a full night's sleep in a week. Not because you're not tired, you're exhausted in ways that make marathon runners look energetic, but because sleeping requires feeling safe, and feeling safe requires not being in a place where people are constantly trying to kill you. Every time you start to drift off, something wakes you up. Artillery fire, machine gun bursts, someone screaming, rats running across your face, or just the general anxiety that comes from sleeping in a hole in the ground while a war happens around you. Sleep deprivation doesn't just make you tired, it makes your brain stop working properly. You start seeing things that aren't there. You start hearing voices. You start making decisions that a well-rested person would recognize as completely insane. Your nervous system has shifted into a state of constant alert that's exhausting to maintain but impossible to turn off. Every sound might be danger. Every shadow might be an enemy. Every moment of quiet might be the calm before an attack. In your normal life, hypervigilance lasts for maybe 30 seconds when you hear a strange noise at night. Here, it's been going on for a week, and your nervous system is starting to burn out like an engine running in the red zone for too long. You jump at sounds that aren't dangerous. You see threats that don't exist. You interpret neutral events as hostile actions. Your brain's threat detection system has been running at maximum sensitivity for so long that it's starting to malfunction. This is when something strange happens. You stop feeling things normally. Not because you want to, but because your emotional system has reached its capacity and has started shutting down non-essential functions. Fear, which was overwhelming at first, becomes background noise. Disgust, which was powerful when you first encountered trench conditions, becomes just another part of daily life. Even hope, which kept you going the first few days, starts to feel like a luxury you can't afford. This emotional flatline isn't depression in the way you understand it. It's more like your brain's way of protecting itself from a situation that's too intense to process normally. If you felt everything that was happening to you at full intensity, you go completely insane. So instead, you feel everything at about 20% intensity, which is just enough to function but not enough to maintain your humanity. Chapter 20. The routine becomes survival. By the second week, something strange happens. The routine that seemed unbearable becomes the only thing keeping you sane. Wake up in filth, eat terrible food, maintain the trench, avoid getting killed, crawl through no man's land, attempt sleep, repeat. It's horrible, but it's predictable horrible. And predictable horrible is better than unpredictable horrible. You start to find comfort in the routine, not because it's comfortable, but because it's familiar. You know what comes next. You know what's expected of you. You know how to get through each part of the day without dying. This is when you realize something that would terrify your pre-war self. You're adapting. Your body is learning to function on less sleep, worse food, and constant stress. Your mind is learning to process horror as routine. Your senses are learning to distinguish between dangerous sounds and merely unpleasant sounds. You're becoming good at being a trench soldier, and that should be terrifying, because becoming good at this means becoming less human in some fundamental way. You no longer gag at the smell of the latrine. You no longer flinch at the sound of artillery. You no longer feel surprised when someone dies. These things are just part of the environment now, like weather or gravity. But here's something unexpected. You are forming friendships that are deeper than anything you've experienced in your modern life. When you share conditions this extreme with other people, when you depend on each other for survival, when you're all equally miserable and equally determined to survive, you form bonds that peacetime friendships can't match. Tommy isn't just your friend. He's the person who makes sure you don't get lost in no man's land. You're not just his friend. You're the person who shares his mail from home and listens to him talk about his sweetheart back in Yorkshire. These friendships are built on shared suffering, mutual dependence, and the knowledge that any day might be the last day you see each other alive. There's no pretense, no small talk, no social media performance, just raw human connection between people who are all in the same impossible situation. Chapter 21, The Attack, when theory becomes reality. 3 weeks into your stay in hell, someone blows a whistle. This isn't the gentle tweet of a referee's whistle at a soccer game. This is a sharp, urgent blast that means one thing. It's time to climb out of your hole and try to kill people while they try to kill you back. Over the top, shouts an officer who looks like he'd rather be anywhere else in the universe. This is it. The moment every war movie has tried to capture, but never quite managed to convey, the absolute terror of climbing out of a trench and running across open ground while people shoot at you with weapons designed to kill you efficiently. You climb over the parapet, the front wall of your trench, and suddenly you're standing in no man's land in broad daylight, which is like painting a bullseye on your chest and then standing in front of people who enjoy target practice. The first thing you notice is that running across a battlefield is nothing like running in your neighborhood. This isn't a nice, flat surface with good traction. This is churned up mud, shell craters, barbed wire, and debris that includes everything from broken equipment to pieces of people who tried the same thing yesterday. You're carrying 60 pounds of equipment, wearing boots that were designed for standing, not running, and trying to move quickly across terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. The enemy has machine guns pointed at the field you're trying to cross. These aren't the machine guns you see in movies where the hero can dodge bullets by rolling behind conveniently placed cover. These are industrial-grade killing machines that can fire 600 rounds per minute with mechanical precision. Do the math. 600 rounds per minute means 10 rounds per second. The field you're crossing is about 100 yards wide, and you can run maybe 10 yards per second if you're lucky and don't trip over anything. That means you're in the killing zone for about 10 seconds, during which time a single machine gun can fire 100 rounds in your general direction. And there's not just one machine gun. While you're trying to avoid machine gun fire, the enemy artillery is also participating in the festivities. Artillery shells explode with enough force to create craters big enough to park a car in, and they throw metal fragments in every direction at speeds that would make a NASCAR driver impressed. You can hear the shells coming. They make a whistling sound that starts high and gets lower as they get closer, which is nature's way of building suspense before trying to kill you. When a shell explodes near you, the concussion wave hits you like getting punched by an invisible giant. It doesn't just make noise. It hits your entire body with pressure that makes your organs rearrange themselves temporarily and makes your brain forget how to work properly for a few seconds. As you run across this field, you start to encounter obstacles that weren't in the training manual. Other people who are also trying to cross this field. Some successfully, some less so. Some of them are running like you, trying to get across before someone shoots them. Some of them are crawling because they've been shot but aren't dead yet. Some of them have decided that staying in one of the shell craters is better than continuing to run, and they're probably right. And some of them aren't moving at all because they've discovered that the machine gun mathematics was correct, and they were on the wrong side of the equation. You have to navigate around these obstacles while running, which is like playing a video game where the obstacles are your friends, and the penalty for bumping into them is feeling terrible about yourself while people continue to shoot at you. Chapter 22. The objective. What you're dying for. Assuming you survive crossing no man's land, and that's a big assumption, your objective is to capture the enemy trench, which is exactly like your trench, except full of people who really don't want you there. The enemy soldiers in that trench are in exactly the same situation you were in 20 minutes ago. They're scared, exhausted, poorly fed, and homesick, and now a bunch of people are running at them with bayonets, trying to kill them in their own hole. This is where war stops being about strategy and politics and becomes about individual human beings trying to kill each other at close range with sharp objects. Bayonet fighting isn't the dramatic sword-fighting choreography you see in movies. It's more like the world's worst hockey fight, except instead of hockey sticks, everyone has rifles with knives attached. And instead of a penalty box, the losers die. Your rifle with the bayonet attached is now about 7 feet long and weighs as much as a small piano. You're trying to use this unwieldy weapon to stab people, while they try to use their unwieldy weapons to stab you, all in a narrow trench that was designed for standing, not fighting. Everyone is slipping in the mud, tripping over equipment, and generally trying to murder each other while dealing with the same coordination challenges that make you look stupid when you try to use chopsticks. Let's say, hypothetically, that you survive crossing no man's land and survive the close quarters fighting and actually manage to capture the enemy trench. Congratulations, you've won. Your prize? You now get to live in a slightly different hole in the ground that's exactly as miserable as your previous hole, except now it's full of enemy dead bodies that you have to do something with. And the enemy is now going to spend the rest of the day trying to take their trench back from you. Oh, and you've moved the front line forward by maybe 100 yards, which in a war where the front lines stretch for hundreds of miles is like making progress on paying off your student loans by finding a nickel in your couch cushions. Here's the part that would make any modern person question the entire concept of sanity. For that 100 yards of muddy ground, the attack probably cost hundreds of lives, maybe thousands, depending on how the day went. These aren't video game deaths that reset when you restart the level. These are real people. Guys like Tommy, who had sweethearts back home and mothers who worry about them and plans for after the war, who are now dead or dying because someone decided that particular piece of mud was strategically important. And tomorrow, the other side might launch their own attack to take it back, and the whole process will repeat itself, except in reverse. Chapter 23. The aftermath. Cleaning up the mess. After an attack, assuming you survive it, comes the aftermath, which is somehow worse than the attack itself. The battlefield is now littered with the consequences of the day's activities. Wounded men who need help, dead men who need burying, and equipment that needs collecting. This isn't a job for specialists. This is a job for whoever's still alive and can walk. Collecting the wounded is like being a paramedic, except with no ambulance, no medical equipment, and people shooting at you while you work. You crawl back out onto the battlefield to find men who are hurt but not dead, and then you drag them back to your trench. Some of them are hurt in ways that modern medicine could fix easily. Some of them are hurt in ways that 1916 medicine can't fix at all. The wounded men are scared, in pain, and often delirious from shock and blood loss. They grab onto you like you're their salvation, and you have to drag them across the same terrible ground you just crossed while running. Except now you're moving slowly and you're both easy targets. Some of the wounded men weigh more than you do. Some of them are hurt in ways that make moving them cause additional damage. Some of them beg you to just leave them where they are because they know they're dying, and they don't want to make you a target too. Then there's the job that nobody talks about in war stories, cleaning up the dead bodies. Dead bodies on a battlefield aren't like dead bodies in movies, where attractive actors lie peacefully with maybe a small trickle of fake blood. Real dead bodies are a logistical problem that involves smells, fluids, and practical challenges that would make a mortician quit his job. Bodies left in the sun and rain for more than a day start to decompose, which creates health hazards for everyone who's still alive. They also create psychological hazards, because seeing what you might look like tomorrow has a way of affecting your mental health today. You have to collect these bodies and do something with them. Sometimes that means burial, if there's time and tools. Sometimes that means just moving them to a place where they won't be a health hazard. Sometimes that means things we don't talk about in polite company. Finally, there's equipment collection, which sounds mundane until you realize that everything on a battlefield has been through the same experience you just had. Getting shot at, exploded at, and generally treated poorly by people with violent intentions. Rifles that have been dropped by their owners might still work, or they might be broken in ways that won't become apparent until you try to use them and they explode in your hands. Ammunition might be good, or it might be damaged in ways that make it dangerous to the person using it rather than the person it's aimed at. Personal effects, letters, photographs, personal items, need to be collected and sent home to families who are going to receive them along with news that nobody wants to deliver. Chapter 24. The letters home. Creative writing under pressure. After an attack, there are letters to write. Not fun letters about your day or what you had for lunch, but the kind of letters that require you to find words for things that don't have words. Some of these letters are to your own family, assuming you survived the attack and want to let them know you're still alive, without mentioning why that's noteworthy. Dear Mother, we had some excitement yesterday, but everything worked out fine. The weather continues to be variable and the food is adequate. I hope you're well. This is how you describe surviving a battle in which hundreds of people died. Some excitement that worked out fine. But the harder letters are the ones you write for guys who can't write their own letters anymore because they're dead. Tommy's sweetheart in Yorkshire needs to know that Tommy isn't coming home, but she doesn't need to know exactly how Tommy died, or what he looked like afterward, or what his last words were, which were probably not suitable for sending to a young lady anyway. So you write something like, Dear Miss Thompson, I regret to inform you that Tommy died bravely while serving his country. He spoke of you often, and wanted you to know that he loved you very much. He did not suffer. Everything in that letter, except the first part, is probably a lie, but they're compassionate lies designed to help someone cope with news that's going to destroy their world. The officers' reports. Meanwhile, the officers are writing their own letters, reports to headquarters, that reduce the day's carnage to numbers and strategic assessments. Advanced, 100 yards across difficult terrain. Casualties moderate. Objective achieved. Recommend resupply of ammunition and replacements for personnel. Casualties moderate means that maybe half the men who started the day are still alive and functional. Personnel replacements means they need new people to replace the ones who are dead or broken. These reports turn human tragedy into administrative paperwork, which is probably the only way anyone could psychologically handle being responsible for sending hundreds of people to their deaths for 100 yards of mud. Chapter 25. The reinforcements. Fresh meat for the grinder. A few days after the attack, new soldiers arrived to replace the ones who didn't survive it. These replacements are fresh from training camps in England, and they look like you looked 3 weeks ago. Clean, optimistic, and completely unprepared for what they're walking into. They have the same misconceptions you had about war being heroic and purposeful. They think they're going to make a difference, win the war, and go home to heroes' welcomes. You look at these new guys and realize that you now see them the way Tommy saw you, as fresh meat for a grinder that processes human beings into casualties with industrial efficiency. You're assigned to help train the new replacements, which means you have to explain trench warfare to people who think war looks like the recruitment posters. How do you explain to someone that the most important skill they'll learn is how to sleep while sitting up in mud? How do you tell someone that their primary job is to live in conditions that would be considered torture in peacetime? How do you prepare someone for the moment when they realize that everything they thought they knew about human civilization was wrong? You can't. So instead, you teach them practical things. How to clean their rifle in the mud. How to eat terrible food without getting sick. How to recognize the sound of different types of artillery. How to crawl through barbed wire without getting caught. These new soldiers look at you with a mixture of respect and horror. Respect because you've survived 3 weeks in hell, which makes you a veteran. Horror because you look like what they're going to look like in 3 weeks. Hollow-eyed, prematurely aged, and fundamentally changed by experiences that don't have names. There are things you know now that you can't teach, because they have to be learned through experience. You know what it sounds like when an artillery shell is going to land close to you versus far from you. You know the difference between machine gun fire that's aimed at your section and machine gun fire that's aimed somewhere else. You know that the real enemy isn't the German soldiers across no man's land. They're just people in the same situation as you, trying to survive until they can go home. The real enemy is the war itself, this machine that consumes human beings and produces nothing but misery and statistics. You know that courage isn't what you thought it was. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done while being absolutely terrified. Every single person in this trench is scared every single minute of every single day. The ones who survive are the ones who can function while scared. Chapter 26. The winter experience, when bad becomes worse. Just when you think you've experienced the worst that trench warfare has to offer, winter arrives to prove you wrong. Winter in a WWI trench isn't like winter in your centrally heated, well-insulated modern life. This is winter when you're living underground in conditions that were already miserable when it was warm. The mud that was just uncomfortable in autumn becomes frozen concrete in winter. The wooden duckboards that you walk on become ice rinks, designed by someone with a grudge against human coordination. The metal parts of your rifle become so cold they can freeze to your skin if you touch them without gloves. Your wool uniform, which was scratchy and uncomfortable in warm weather, becomes your only defense against temperatures that can kill you through exposure. The problem is that wool uniform was designed for looking military, not for keeping someone warm in sub-freezing temperatures while living in a hole in the ground. You layer everything you own, Multiple shirts, extra socks, whatever blankets you can find, anything that might provide additional insulation. You end up looking like someone cosplaying as a very sad marshmallow and you're still cold. The worst part is that you can't move normally while wearing all these layers. Everything takes longer, requires more effort, and becomes more dangerous because you can't react quickly when people start shooting at you. Your modern body has never experienced real cold, the kind of cold that actually damages tissue. Your fingers and toes, which have spent their entire lives in climate-controlled environments, are now dealing with temperatures that can cause frostbite in minutes. Frostbite isn't just being really cold, it's when parts of your body literally freeze, and the tissue dies from lack of blood flow. Your fingers turn white, then blue, then black, and then they fall off. This isn't a metaphor. Parts of your body can actually detach due to cold exposure. You spend hours every day trying to keep your extremities warm by flexing your fingers and toes, rubbing your hands together, and doing whatever exercises you can manage in the confined space of the trench. This isn't for comfort, it's to prevent permanent disability or death. Staying warm in a trench presents unique challenges. You can't build a normal fire because the smoke would give away your position to enemy snipers and artillery spotters. Any heat source has to be small, contained, and as smokeless as possible. The soldiers use small braziers, metal containers that burn charcoal or wood scraps, but fuel is scarce, and sharing one brazier among 30 men in a space designed for 15 means everyone gets just enough heat to remember what being warm felt like. You huddle around these tiny heat sources like prehistoric humans around a campfire, except prehistoric humans probably had better living conditions and more reliable food sources. Chapter 27, The Disease. Parade. When your body declares independence. Living in these conditions doesn't just make you uncomfortable. It makes you sick in ways that would baffle modern medicine and horrify modern health inspectors. Trench fever is transmitted by lice, causes high fever and severe pain, and can incapacitate you for weeks. Since everyone has lice and there's no way to get rid of them, trench fever spreads through the trenches like gossip through a small town. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water and food, turns your digestive system into a biological weapon aimed at yourself. You're simultaneously dehydrated and unable to keep fluids down, weak from malnutrition and unable to eat, and constantly needing bathroom facilities that don't exist. Your lungs, which have spent their entire life breathing relatively clean air, are now processing air that contains mud particles, smoke from various sources, chemical residues from gas attacks, and whatever bacteria and viruses are floating around in the enclosed space of the trench. Respiratory infections spread through these trenches like wildfire because you're living in close quarters with 30 other people who are all coughing, sneezing, and breathing the same recycled air. There's no isolation for sick people, no antibiotics, and no effective treatments for most respiratory problems. You develop a cough that sounds like a broken engine and feels like someone is scraping the inside of your lungs with sandpaper. This cough becomes part of your identity. Everyone in the trench has some version of it, and you can recognize individual soldiers by the sound of their cough. But the physical diseases are almost manageable compared to what's happening to everyone's mental health. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, affects almost everyone in the trenches to some degree. The constant stress, the sleep deprivation, the random violence, and the complete lack of control over your environment combine to break down the psychological defenses that keep people sane. Some men develop uncontrollable shaking. Others become unable to speak. Some have nightmares so vivid they can't tell the difference between sleeping and waking. Others develop obsessive behaviors, compulsively cleaning their rifle, counting ammunition, or repeating the same conversation over and over. The military's solution to shell shock is basically get over it, which is about as effective as treating a broken leg by telling someone to walk it off. Chapter 28, The Christmas Truce, When Humanity Breaks Through. December 1916 brings something unexpected. Christmas. Christmas in a trench is surreal in ways that would make a surrealist painter give up and become an accountant. You're celebrating the birth of someone who preached love and peace while living in a hole in the ground, surrounded by weapons, preparing to kill people who are celebrating the same holiday 100 yards away. Some packages arrive from home containing Christmas gifts, cookies that have turned into crumbs during the journey, scarves knitted by mothers who don't understand that fashion isn't a priority when you're living in a hole, and letters wishing you a Merry Christmas and a quick end to this business. On Christmas Eve, something magical and terrible happens. Both sides informally stop trying to kill each other for a few hours. It's not an official ceasefire. The generals would have apoplexy if they knew, but the soldiers on both sides seem to reach an unspoken agreement that maybe, just for one night, they can pretend to be human beings instead of military equipment. The shooting dies down. Someone on the German side starts singing Silent Night in German. Someone on your side starts singing it in English. Pretty soon, both trenches are having a concert across no man's land, and it's the most beautiful and heartbreaking thing you've ever heard. Some soldiers, Not you, because you're not quite that brave or crazy yet. Actually climb out of their trenches and meet the enemy soldiers in no man's land. They shake hands, share cigarettes, show pictures of their families, and exchange small gifts. For a few hours, the war stops being about nations and ideologies and becomes about individual human beings who realize they have more in common with each other than with the politicians who sent them here. These enemy soldiers look exactly like your own soldiers. Tired, scared, homesick, and wondering how they ended up in this situation. They miss their families, hate the food, complain about their officers, and want nothing more than to go home. The realization that you've been trying to kill people who are exactly like you is either profoundly moving or completely devastating, depending on your philosophical outlook. But Christmas ends, as Christmas always does, and on December 26th, everyone goes back to trying to kill each other because that's what war is, and war doesn't take holidays. The brief glimpse of humanity makes returning to the routine of systematic murder even more absurd. Yesterday, you were sharing cigarettes with Hans from Bavaria, who showed you pictures of his wife and daughter. Today, you're supposed to shoot Hans if you see him because that's your job. This cognitive dissonance, the gap between what you experienced during the Christmas truce and what you're expected to do the rest of the year, is enough to break whatever sanity you had left. Chapter 29, The Spring Offensive, When Hope Becomes a Weapon. Spring 1917 arrives with promises of renewed offensive action, which is military speak for, we're going to try the same thing that didn't work last year but with more enthusiasm. The generals have spent the winter planning new strategies that mostly involve sending more people across the same terrible ground at slightly different times or from slightly different angles. The fundamental problem, the crossing open ground while people shoot at you with machine guns, is a poor survival strategy, remains unsolved. But spring brings optimism because humans are optimistic creatures, even in circumstances that would make pessimism more appropriate. Maybe this time will be different. Maybe the new tactics will work. Maybe the war will end soon and everyone can go home. Preparing for a spring offensive involves weeks of increased activity that makes normal trench life seem peaceful by comparison. More ammunition arrives, which means more stuff to carry and more things that can explode if handled incorrectly. More artillery pieces are brought up, which means more noise, more targets for enemy counter-battery fire, and more evidence that this offensive is going to be larger and more terrible than previous efforts. New equipment arrives, improved gas masks that are slightly less likely to kill you, better helmets that might stop a piece of shrapnel if you're lucky, and updated rifles that jam in new and creative ways. The officers become more excited and optimistic, which is always a bad sign because officer optimism is usually inversely related to soldier survival rates. You attend briefings where officers explain the plan using maps, charts, and enthusiasm that suggests they've never actually been shot at. The plan is sophisticated and detailed. Artillery will bombard the enemy positions for 6 hours, destroying their defenses and demoralizing their troops. Then you'll advance across no man's land, capture their trenches, and continue advancing until you reach their supply lines, at which point the war will essentially be over and everyone can go home for tea and medals. This plan has only one major flaw. It's based on the assumption that the enemy will cooperate by staying in their trenches while being bombarded, not shooting back when you advance, and generally acting like the cardboard targets used in training exercises. The artillery bombardment begins exactly as planned, and for 6 hours, the landscape between your trench and theirs is subjected to the most intensive fireworks display in human history. Thousands of shells rain down on the enemy positions, creating explosions that can be heard for miles and producing smoke clouds that block out the sun. The ground shakes constantly like being inside a bass drum played by an enthusiastic giant with no sense of rhythm. This bombardment is supposed to destroy the enemy defenses and make your advance easy and safe. What it actually does is warn the enemy that an attack is coming, give them 6 hours to prepare for it, and turn the ground. You'll have to cross into a lunar landscape of craters and debris that makes movement even more difficult than it was before. Chapter 30. The Big Push, When Optimism Meets Reality. When the artillery bombardment ends, there's a moment of silence that feels like the world holding its breath. Then the whistle blows, and it's time for the big push that's going to win the war. You climb over the parapet with several thousand other optimistic people and immediately discover that the artillery bombardment, while impressive, has not actually solved the fundamental problems of trench warfare. The enemy is still alive, still armed, and still extremely motivated to prevent you from taking their hole in the ground. The machine guns that were supposed to be destroyed by artillery fire are still functional and operated by people who seem to take their job seriously. This time, instead of advancing across 100 yards of no man's land with 30 other guys, you're advancing across 200 yards of no man's land with 3,000 other guys, which changes the mathematics considerably, but not in ways that favor your survival. More targets means the machine gunners have more opportunities to practice their marksmanship. More people in the same space means more crowding, more confusion, and more opportunities for things to go wrong in creative ways. The artillery that was supposed to clear the path has instead created new obstacles. Shell craters that are deep enough to hide a small building, debris fields that require climbing skills, and soft spots in the ground where you can sink up to your waist in mud that has the consistency of wet concrete. Halfway across, no man's land, the advance stalls as thousands of people encounter the same obstacles simultaneously. What was supposed to be a rapid advance becomes a traffic jam, where everyone is standing around in the open while people shoot at them from prepared positions. Some units get lost in the maze of shell craters and end up advancing in the wrong direction. Other units encounter obstacles that weren't on the maps and have to improvise solutions while under fire. Still, other units find that their objectives have been so thoroughly destroyed by their own artillery that they can't tell what they're supposed to capture. The coordination that looks so elegant on the briefing room maps turns into chaos that would challenge a professional disaster coordinator. After a day of this, some units actually manage to capture some enemy trenches, which technically counts as success and will be reported as such in the newspapers back home. The cost of this success is measured in thousands of casualties, dead, wounded, missing, or just psychologically broken by the experience. The gain is measured in hundreds of yards of territory that wasn't particularly valuable before the war, and isn't particularly valuable now. But it's progress, technically, and progress is what everyone back home wants to hear about. The newspapers will report the advance, mention the heroism of the troops, and skip over the part where thousands of people died for strategic objectives that could have been achieved by walking around the problem if this was a rational enterprise instead of a war. Chapter 31, The Wounded, When the Lucky Ones Get to Leave. After the spring offensive, the casualty clearing stations are overwhelmed with people who have been damaged in various ways by their encounter with industrial-grade violence. The wounded are divided into categories that would make a triage nurse weep. Those who can be patched up and sent back to fighting, those who are too damaged to fight but might survive, and those who are dying but haven't finished the process yet. Military medicine in 1917 is advanced for its time, which is like saying that your smartphone is advanced compared to a telegraph. They can do things that medieval surgeons couldn't dream of, but they can't do things that modern paramedics consider routine. They can amputate limbs with relatively low mortality rates, thanks to improved surgical techniques and better understanding of infection control. They can treat some types of wounds that would have been automatically fatal 50 years earlier. They can manage pain better than previous generations, though better is relative when your pain management options are morphine, alcohol, and bite down on the stick. What they can't do is treat the kinds of injuries that modern trauma centers handle routinely. Complex internal injuries, severe burns, traumatic brain injuries, and anything requiring sophisticated diagnostic equipment are essentially death sentences. But the wounded aren't just the people with visible physical injuries. A significant percentage of the casualties are psychological. Men who are physically intact, but mentally shattered by experiences that human minds weren't designed to process. These psychological casualties present a challenge that the military medical system isn't equipped to handle. There's no established treatment for shell shock, no understanding of PTSD, and definitely no patience for soldiers who can't fight because they're just mentally broken. Some of these men are court-martialed for cowardice because they can't stop shaking enough to hold a rifle. Others are sent back to the front lines with instructions to pull themselves together and remember their duty to king and country. A few are sent home with medical discharges, where they'll spend the rest of their lives trying to explain to people who weren't there why they wake up screaming and can't handle the sound of fireworks. Among the wounded, both physical and psychological, there's an emotion that doesn't have a name yet, but will eventually be called survivor's guilt. The crushing psychological weight of being alive when so many others are dead. Why did Tommy get killed by the shell that landed 5 feet to the left while you only got wounded by shrapnel? Why did the machine gun bullet hit the man next to you instead of you? Why did you survive the gas attack that killed half your unit? These questions don't have answers, but the human mind demands answers anyway, so it makes up answers that usually involve some form of self-blame. You survived because you were lucky, but your brain tells you that you survived because you were a coward, or because you didn't deserve to die as much as the others did, or because there's something fundamentally wrong with a universe where random chance determines who lives and who dies. Chapter 32, The Rotation System. Getting out alive. After 3 months in the trenches, you're finally due for rotation to a rest area, which sounds like a vacation until you realize that rest area, in military terminology, means place where they prepare you to go back to the trenches. The rotation system exists because the military has discovered that keeping people in combat conditions indefinitely results in psychological and physical breakdown at rates that make it difficult to maintain an effective fighting force. Even the most dedicated soldiers reach a point where they become more of a liability than an asset. Leaving the trenches is surprisingly emotional. You've spent 3 months in the worst conditions imaginable with people who have become closer to you than family, and now you're being separated from them to go to a place where you'll eat better food, sleep in a real bed, and probably never see them again. Some of these men will die while you're away. Some of them will be transferred to other units. Some of them will be wounded and shipped home. The chances of the same group of people being together again are essentially zero, so this departure is also a permanent goodbye. You pack your few possessions, a spare pair of socks that have achieved structural integrity through accumulated dirt, letters from home that you've read so many times they're falling apart, and whatever small mementos you've collected during your stay in hell. The journey from the front lines to the rest area involves walking away from the war, and the physical distance creates a psychological distance that's both relief and disconnection. With each mile you walk away from the trenches, the sound of artillery gets quieter, the air gets cleaner, and the landscape starts to look more like the world you remember from before the war. You see trees that still have leaves, buildings that still have roofs, and people who aren't wearing uniforms and carrying weapons. This gradual transition from war to peace is jarring in ways you didn't expect. Your senses, which have been calibrated for survival in a hostile environment, don't know how to process a world where not every sound is potentially dangerous, and not every shadow might be hiding an enemy. The rest camp is civilization compared to the trenches, which is like saying that a prison is comfortable compared to a torture chamber. Technically true, but missing the broader context. You get to sleep in a bed, which is revolutionary after 3 months of sleeping on wooden planks. The bed has sheets that are relatively clean, a pillow that's softer than a sandbag, and nobody shooting at the building while you sleep. You get to eat food that resembles food, prepared by people who seem to understand that food is supposed to be edible. There's meat that you can identify, vegetables that haven't been stored in mud, and bread that doesn't require architectural engineering to chew. But there's a problem. You no longer fit in civilian-style environments, even military civilian-style environments. Your table manners have deteriorated to the point where eating with utensils seems unnecessarily complicated. Your conversation skills have been reduced to the essential communications required for survival, plus a vocabulary of profanity that would make a sailor blush. You can't sleep properly in a quiet environment because your nervous system is calibrated for sleeping through artillery bombardments, and the absence of constant life-threatening noise registers as something is wrong rather than everything is fine. Chapter 33, The Letters Home. Advanced Creative Writing. During your stay in the rest camp, you have the opportunity to write longer, more detailed letters home, which presents the challenge of describing your experiences to people who live in a world where the biggest daily stress is deciding what to have for breakfast. How do you explain trench warfare to someone whose biggest concern is whether it might rain on their picnic? How do you describe living with the constant possibility of death to someone who considers a delayed train to be a major inconvenience? Your letters are still subject to censorship, so you can't be completely honest, even if you wanted to be. But by now you've learned to communicate around the censorship in ways that convey information without technically violating the rules. Instead of writing, "The artillery bombardment was terrifying and several men in my unit were killed," you write, "We had some excitement yesterday, and I'm sorry to say that Tom and Bill won't be writing home anymore." The censors allow this because it doesn't contain specific military information, but your family will understand what happened. Instead of describing the horrible conditions, you write, "The accommodations here are quite rustic, and I'm looking forward to a hot bath and a home-cooked meal when I return." This passes censorship while conveying that conditions are terrible and you're not enjoying the tourist aspects of France. But even without censorship, you discover that you can't write truthfully about your experiences because the truth would serve no useful purpose. What would be accomplished by telling your mother that you've seen things that have fundamentally changed your understanding of human nature? How would it help your girlfriend to know that you've done things that the person she fell in love with would have considered morally impossible? The truth would make your loved ones worry about things they can't control, suffer for experiences they didn't have, and fear for your future in ways that wouldn't help anyone involved. Instead, you write carefully crafted lies that preserve everyone's ability to function. "I'm doing well, the food isn't too bad, and I'm making some good friends. I miss you and I love you and I'll be home soon." Every word of this is technically false, but it's false in service of a greater truth, that you love these people enough to protect them from reality. Chapter 34, The Training Refresher, Learning New Ways to Die. Part of your rest period involves refresher training, which sounds educational until you realize that it means learning about new weapons, new tactics, and new ways that the enemy is trying to kill you. The war has been going on for 3 years now, and both sides have been busy inventing more efficient methods of turning human beings into casualties. Your refresher training covers these innovations with the enthusiasm of someone describing new features on a smartphone. New machine guns have been developed that are more reliable, more accurate, and capable of higher rates of fire than the ones that were trying to kill you 3 months ago. This information is presented as though it's good news, since these new machine guns will be used by your side to kill enemy soldiers more efficiently. The fact that the enemy has also been developing new machine guns to kill you more efficiently is mentioned as well, but in a more subdued tone that suggests this is a minor detail that shouldn't affect your overall optimism about the war's progress. New artillery has been developed that can fire larger shells with greater accuracy over longer distances than the artillery that was trying to kill you 3 months ago. Again, this is presented as positive development, since your side will use these improvements to kill enemy soldiers more efficiently. Chemical weapons have also seen significant innovations during your absence from the front lines. New gases have been developed that are more toxic, harder to detect, and more persistent in the environment than the gases that were trying to kill you 3 months ago. Your gas mask training is updated to cover new procedures for detecting and responding to these improved chemical weapons. The training is thorough and professional, but there's an underlying assumption that your gas mask will work properly, that you'll have time to put it on correctly, and that the new gases won't penetrate your protection in ways that the old gases couldn't. This training is necessary because chemical weapons represent a category of death that's particularly horrible. Poison gas doesn't just kill you, it tortures you first, in ways specifically designed to maximize suffering and terror. Military tactics have also evolved during your 3-month absence, though evolved might be too generous a term for changes that mostly involve sending people across the same deadly ground using slightly different timing or formations. The concept of creeping barrage has been refined, where artillery fire moves forward at a predetermined pace, and infantry follows behind it at a distance calculated to maximize damage to the enemy while minimizing damage to your own troops. The calculations involved in this coordination are complex and theoretical, and the margin for error is measured in lives lost to friendly fire. New communication techniques have been developed to coordinate these complex operations, involving signals, runners, and telephone lines that work until they're cut by artillery fire, at which point coordination becomes a matter of individual initiative and luck. Chapter 35. The Return Journey. Back to the grinder. After 2 weeks in the rest camp, which passed faster than any 2 weeks in your previous life, it's time to return to the trenches. The journey back is the reverse of the journey out, but psychologically, it's completely different. Walking toward the war instead of away from it changes everything about the experience. The sound of artillery gets louder with each mile, and louder means closer to the place where people are trying to kill you. The landscape becomes more damaged, more desolate, more clearly the product of industrial-scale violence. Your mind, which had begun to adjust to sleeping without constant noise, eating decent food, and living without immediate threats, now has to readjust to conditions that were barely tolerable the first time around. But something has changed during your absence. You now know that alternatives exist. For 3 months, you lived in hell and adapted to hell because hell was all there was. For 2 weeks, you lived in something approaching normal human conditions, and now you know what you're missing. This knowledge makes returning to the trenches harder, not easier. When hell is all you know, you can convince yourself that hell is normal. When you know what normal looks like, hell becomes clearly identifiable as hell, and adapting to it becomes a conscious choice rather than an unconscious necessity. When you return to your section of trench, you discover that most of the faces are new. The men you lived with for 3 months, the men who became closer to you than family, have been replaced by new soldiers who look like you looked 6 months ago, clean, optimistic, and completely unprepared. Some of the familiar faces are gone because they were killed while you were away. Some are gone because they were wounded badly enough to be sent home. Some are gone because they were transferred to other units or promoted to positions that required them to move elsewhere. Tommy is gone. The specific circumstances of Tommy's departure are unclear. The new men know he's not coming back, but nobody wants to explain exactly why not. And you understand that some questions are better left unasked. You're now considered an experienced soldier, someone who has survived long enough to be valuable for training new replacements and leading patrols. This is supposed to be an honor, recognition of your competence and survival skills. What it actually means is that you're now responsible for keeping other people alive, in conditions where keeping yourself alive requires all of your attention and more luck than any reasonable person should expect to have. You look at these new soldiers and see yourself from 6 months ago, convinced that courage and determination are enough, believing that the war makes sense and has clear objectives, expecting that survival is mostly a matter of being brave and following orders. Chapter 36, the teaching moment, passing on hard wisdom. Training. New soldiers becomes your primary responsibility, and it's harder than you expected because the most important lessons can't be taught through instruction. They have to be learned through experience. You can teach someone how to clean their rifle, how to repair barbed wire, how to recognize different types of artillery fire by sound. These are technical skills that can be demonstrated and practiced. What you can't teach is the psychological adaptation required to function in an environment where death is random, constant, and completely outside your control. You can't teach someone how to sleep while scared, how to eat terrible food when you're nauseated by stress, or how to make rational decisions when your rational mind has been overwhelmed by circumstances that don't make rational sense. There are things you know now that would be cruel to share with new soldiers because knowing them wouldn't help their performance or survival chances. It would just make them more afraid. You know that the war isn't going to end soon, despite what the officers say about one more big push and breaking through the enemy lines. But you've seen enough big pushes to understand that the tactical situation is essentially stable, and both sides are going to keep throwing men at each other until someone runs out of men to throw. You know that survival is mostly luck, not skill or courage or intelligence. The bravest, smartest, most skilled soldiers die at approximately the same rate as everyone else, because artillery shells and machine gun bullets don't check your personnel file before deciding whether to kill you. You know that the enemy soldiers are just people in the same impossible situation, trying to survive long enough to go home to families who miss them just as much as your family misses you. So instead of sharing the big, depressing truths, you focus on the small, practical lessons that might actually help keep someone alive for another day. You teach them to recognize the sound of incoming artillery with enough precision to know whether to duck, run, or just accept that this might be their time. You teach them to distinguish between rifle fire that's aimed at your section and rifle fire that's aimed somewhere else. You teach them trench maintenance techniques that will prevent cave-ins, water management methods that will prevent trench foot, and personal hygiene practices that will prevent diseases that are more dangerous than enemy action. Most importantly, you teach them how to function as part of a team where everyone's survival depends on everyone else's competence and attention to detail. Chapter 37, The Second Winter, When Experience Becomes Burden. Your second winter in the trenches is different from your first, and not in good ways. During your first winter, you were learning how to survive, adapting to conditions you'd never imagined, developing skills and knowledge that kept you alive. There was a sense of progression, of getting better at an incredibly difficult job. During your second winter, you know exactly what you're facing, and that knowledge makes it worse rather than better. You know how long winter lasts in the trenches. You know how cold you're going to be, how hungry you're going to get, how sick you're probably going to become. You know that spring will bring another offensive, and you know what offensives cost in human lives and suffering. You know that some of the new men you're training won't survive to see another spring, and you know that knowing this doesn't help anyone involved. Being an expert at trench warfare is like being an expert at being tortured. The knowledge doesn't make the experience better. It just makes you more aware of all the ways things can go wrong. You can predict when artillery bombardments are going to start based on subtle changes in enemy activity patterns. You can estimate casualty rates for proposed operations based on terrain, weather, and enemy defensive positions. You can identify the early symptoms of diseases that will kill people if left untreated. This expertise makes you valuable to the military, but it makes the war harder to endure psychologically. Ignorance was bliss, even when bliss was a relative term for living in a hole in the ground while people tried to kill you. Your status as an experienced soldier means you're now responsible for decisions that affect other people's survival. When you plan patrol routes, choose defensive positions, or train new soldiers, your mistakes get other people killed. This responsibility is heavier than the physical weight of your equipment, heavier than the emotional weight of your own fear, and heavier than anything your previous life prepared you to carry. Every decision becomes a calculation of risks and benefits where the stakes are measured in human lives, and there are no perfect answers, only choices between different types of terrible outcomes. By your second winter, you've developed an unconscious but accurate understanding of survival mathematics in trench warfare. In any given week, there's a certain percentage chance that you'll be killed by artillery, a certain percentage chance you'll be killed by sniper fire, a certain percentage chance you'll be killed during an attack, and a certain percentage chance you'll die from disease or accident. These percentages are small individually, but they add up over time, and time is not on your side. The longer you stay in this environment, the more likely it becomes that one of these random events will have your name on it. You've stopped thinking about surviving the war and started thinking about surviving each day, each week, each month. Long-term planning becomes an exercise in optimism that borders on delusion. The most psychologically challenging aspect of being an experienced soldier is the friendship paradox. You need human connections to maintain your sanity, but every human connection becomes a source of potential grief. You've learned not to get too close to new soldiers because new soldiers have the highest casualty rates. You've learned not to invest too much emotional energy in people who statistically probably won't be alive in 3 months. But humans are social creatures, and isolation in these conditions is its own form of psychological torture. So you form friendships anyway, knowing that most of them will end badly, because the alternative is going insane from loneliness while surrounded by people. Your second spring offensive is different from your first, primarily because everyone involved, from generals to privates, now understands that these offensives are essentially elaborate forms of suicide with strategic objectives attached. The planning is more sophisticated, the artillery preparation is more extensive, and the tactical coordination is more complex than anything attempted in previous years. The generals have learned from their mistakes and developed new approaches to the fundamental problem of getting men across open ground while other men try to kill them. The fundamental problem, however, remains unsolved. By 1918, both sides are running out of everything: men, equipment, money, and public support for continuing the war. This desperation creates a psychological atmosphere where increasingly risky strategies start to seem reasonable. The German Spring Offensive, which you experience from the receiving end, involves throwing everything they have left at your section of the line in a final attempt to win the war before they run out of resources to continue fighting. This means the attacks are larger, more intense, and more desperate than anything you've experienced before. The enemy is no longer fighting for strategic objectives. They're fighting for national survival, which makes them significantly more dangerous. Being on the receiving end of a desperate enemy offensive is like being in a building during an earthquake. Except the earthquake is caused by thousands of people who want you dead and have industrial-grade equipment to make that happen. The artillery bombardment that precedes the attack is so intense that it fundamentally changes the landscape. Trees disappear completely, buildings are reduced to piles of rubble, and the ground is churned up so thoroughly that it looks like the surface of an alien planet. Your trench, which you've called home for almost a year now, ceases to exist as a coherent structure. The wooden walls collapse, the duckboards are blown to splinters, and the carefully constructed defensive positions are reduced to randomly scattered piles of sandbags and debris. When the German infantry attack begins, you discover that being attacked by desperate people is significantly worse than being attacked by confident people. Desperate people take risks that confident people won't take. They advance, despite casualties that would stop a more rational attack. They continue fighting even when wounded in ways that should incapacitate them. They use tactics that prioritize immediate results over long-term survival because they don't expect to have a long-term. The attack comes in waves, like a series of human tsunamis, each one larger and more intense than the last. You shoot at people who keep coming even after being shot. You watch men advance through conditions that should be impossible to advance through, driven by desperation that's stronger than rationality. This is when you discover your own breaking point. Not the physical breaking point where your body stops working, but the psychological breaking point where your mind stops processing experience in normal ways. The combination of extreme stress, physical exhaustion, and witnessing violence at industrial scale triggers something that doesn't have a name yet, but will eventually be called dissociation. You continue to function, but you stop feeling like you're the person doing the functioning. You watch yourself shoot at enemy soldiers as though you're watching someone else shoot at enemy soldiers. You hear yourself shouting orders to other soldiers as though someone else is shouting those orders. You feel your body moving through the destroyed landscape as though you're controlling someone else's body. This psychological defense mechanism allows you to continue functioning in circumstances that would otherwise cause complete mental breakdown, but it comes at a cost. You stop feeling like a person and start feeling like a piece of military equipment that happens to be made of meat. Chapter 39, the end approaches, when everyone stops pretending. By autumn 1918, everyone involved in the war, soldiers, officers, politicians, and civilians, has stopped pretending that this enterprise makes sense or has achievable objectives. The German Spring Offensive failed at enormous cost to both sides. The Allied counteroffensives are succeeding, but at enormous cost to both sides. Both sides are exhausted, bankrupt, and running out of men to throw into the meat grinder, but neither side wants to be the first to admit defeat. Rumors of peace negotiations circulate through the trenches like a disease that everyone wants to catch, but nobody quite believes they have. Some officers claim that the war will be over by Christmas, which is what officers have been claiming every year since the war started. Some soldiers claim that the enemy is on the verge of surrender, which is what soldiers have been claiming every time they win a minor tactical victory. But other rumors are more disturbing. Stories of mutinies in other armies, reports of revolution in enemy countries, accounts of civilian populations that are starving and demanding an end to the war, regardless of the strategic situation. You've now been in combat conditions for almost 2 years, which is longer than most soldiers survive and longer than most human minds can process extreme stress without permanent damage. You no longer remember what normal feels like. Your baseline for tolerable conditions has shifted so far that things you would have considered torture 2 years ago now seem merely uncomfortable. Your expectations for human behavior have been adjusted to accommodate realities that your previous worldview couldn't contain. This adaptation has kept you alive, but it's also made you into someone who wouldn't fit into peacetime society, even if peacetime society still existed in the form you remember. The military system that kept you alive for 2 years is starting to break down under the stress of prolonged combat operations beyond its design parameters. Supply lines that worked adequately when the war was expected to last 6 months are failing after 4 years of continuous operation. Equipment that was designed to last for one campaign is being used for the 8th or 9th campaign and failing in creative ways. The human resources system, the process of training, deploying, and replacing soldiers, is running out of humans to process. The pool of men who are old enough to fight but young enough to train, healthy enough to serve but inexperienced enough to deploy, is nearly exhausted. Chapter 40, the armistice, when the music stops. November 11th, 1918, 11:00 a.m. The war ends, not with a dramatic climax or decisive victory, but with a piece of paper signed by people you've never met, taking effect at a time chosen for symbolic rather than practical reasons. The end of the war is announced through the same communication systems that have been announcing attacks, retreats, casualty reports, and tactical updates for 4 years. The message is brief, official, and completely inadequate for describing the end of the most destructive event in human history up to that point. The first thing you notice is the silence. For 4 years, your environment has included constant background noise, artillery fire, machine guns, aircraft engines, men shouting, equipment moving, and all the sounds of industrial-scale violence operating at maximum capacity. When this noise stops, the silence is so profound it's almost physically painful. Your ears, calibrated for detecting threats in a noisy environment, don't know how to process an environment where the absence of sound doesn't mean danger is approaching. The silence reveals other sounds that were previously masked. Birds singing, wind through what's left of the trees, the sound of your own breathing and heartbeat. These sounds seem impossibly delicate and beautiful after years of listening to explosions and gunfire. The emotional response to the end of the war is more complex than simple relief or celebration. Relief requires the ability to feel safe, and feeling safe requires psychological equipment that's been dormant for 2 years. Your nervous system, calibrated for constant vigilance, doesn't trust that the absence of immediate danger means the presence of safety. Celebration requires the ability to feel joy, and joy requires emotional capacity that's been dedicated to survival for so long that it's forgotten how to process positive experiences. What you feel instead is a kind of emotional numbness punctuated by moments of overwhelming confusion. The structure that organized your life for 2 years, the routine of trying to stay alive while helping kill other people, has suddenly disappeared, and nothing has been provided to replace it. The end of the war raises practical questions that nobody seems prepared to answer. What happens now? Where do you go? What do you do with knowledge and skills that are only useful for fighting a war that's over? You're trained to be a soldier in conditions that no longer exist. Your expertise is in survival techniques for circumstances that society hopes will never occur again. Your social bonds are with people who shared experiences that civilians can't understand and don't want to hear about. The transition from war to peace is presented as a return to normal life. But normal life doesn't exist anymore. Not for you, and not for the society you're returning to. Everything has changed, and nothing has been prepared to help anyone adjust to the changes. Chapter 41, The Homecoming, When Heroes Meet Reality. The journey home is the reverse of the journey to war, but you're not the reverse of the person who made that journey. 2 years ago, you traveled toward the war as someone who thought courage and patriotism were sufficient preparation for military service. You're traveling away from the war as someone who knows things about human nature, industrial violence, and psychological survival that you can't unknow and don't want to share. Your first contact with civilian society is jarring in ways you didn't anticipate. Civilians want to treat you as a hero, which requires them to believe that what you did was heroic rather than simply necessary for survival. They want war stories that confirm their beliefs about courage, sacrifice, and noble causes, not stories that reveal war as organized insanity with strategic objectives attached. They want to thank you for your service, which assumes that what you experienced was service rather than a series of traumatic events that you survived through luck and determination. They want you to be grateful for the opportunity to have served your country, which assumes that you experienced opportunity rather than years of systematic dehumanization punctuated by moments of terror. The gap between what you experienced and what civilians can understand is unbridgeable through normal conversation. How do you explain trench warfare to someone whose biggest daily challenge is deciding what to wear? How do you describe living with constant death anxiety to someone who considers a delayed train to be a major stress event? How do you convey the psychological impact of industrial-scale violence to someone who thinks violence means a fist fight after too many drinks at a pub? You can't. The experiences are too different, the emotional costs too extreme, and the practical realities too removed from civilian life for effective translation. Society has developed a mythology around soldier readjustment that assumes the process is temporary, manageable, and ultimately successful for everyone involved. This mythology assumes that soldiers want to forget their war experiences and return to being the people they were before the war. It assumes that time will heal psychological wounds the same way it heals physical wounds. It assumes that the desire to return to normal life is strong enough to overcome the obstacles involved in doing so. All of these assumptions are wrong for most combat veterans, and they're particularly wrong for people who spent 2 years in conditions that would be considered torture if applied to prisoners of war. You discover that you no longer fit in environments you used to consider home. Your family's house feels too clean, too quiet, too safe to be real. The bed is too soft, the food too rich, the conversation too concerned with problems that seem trivial compared to staying alive while people try to kill you. Your family wants you to return to being the person you were before the war, but that person doesn't exist anymore. The war didn't just change your experiences, It changed your fundamental understanding of human nature, social organization, and what constitutes normal behavior under stress. Chapter 42, The Integration Challenge, Fitting Square Pegs into Round Holes. Reintegrating into civilian society requires skills that military service doesn't teach and experiences that war doesn't provide. Civilian social interaction is based on shared assumptions about safety, security, and the predictability of daily life. These assumptions were foreign to you before the war and are now completely alien after 2 years of living with the opposite assumptions. Finding civilian employment presents unique challenges for someone whose primary work experience involves killing people efficiently while avoiding being killed by other people who are trying to kill you efficiently. The skills that kept you alive in combat, hypervigilance, instant threat assessment, the ability to function under extreme stress, and proficiency with weapons designed to kill people, are not easily transferable to civilian occupations. The work habits that military service teaches, following orders without question, accepting authority without discussion, and prioritizing group survival over individual comfort, don't align well with civilian workplace expectations. The psychological traits that combat experience develops, emotional numbing, social isolation, and difficulty with intimate relationships, are counterproductive in civilian, social, and professional contexts. Sleep becomes a major problem in civilian environments, though for different reasons than it was a problem in military environments. In the trenches, you couldn't sleep because of constant noise, danger, and uncomfortable conditions. In civilian life, you can't sleep because of silence, safety, and comfortable conditions. Your nervous system, calibrated for sleeping through artillery bombardments, is overstimulated by the absence of familiar background noise. Your threat detection systems, trained to monitor for dangers that don't exist in civilian environments, can't find anything to monitor and therefore assume they're missing something important. The result is chronic insomnia punctuated by nightmares that replay combat experiences with vivid accuracy and emotional intensity that makes them feel more real than civilian reality. Intimate relationships require emotional availability, vulnerability, and the ability to share experiences and feelings with another person. Combat experience has trained you in the opposite skills: emotional unavailability, psychological armor, and the habit of keeping experiences and feelings private for everyone's protection. The people you care about want to know about your war experiences, but sharing those experiences would traumatize them without helping anyone involved. They want emotional intimacy, but emotional intimacy requires accessing emotions that you've learned to suppress for survival purposes. They want the person they remember from before the war, but that person was killed by the war as surely as if he'd been hit by artillery. The person who survived the war is someone else, someone they don't know and might not like if they did know him. Chapter 43, The Long-Term Consequences, When the War Never Really Ends. The war officially ended in 1918, but for combat veterans, the war continues in forms that don't have names and don't respond to civilian medical or psychological interventions. Your body carries the physical evidence of 2 years in combat conditions: scars from shrapnel wounds, joint damage from carrying heavy equipment across rough terrain, respiratory problems from breathing chemical-contaminated air, and nutritional deficiencies from extended periods of inadequate diet. These physical problems are treatable to some extent, but they're also permanent reminders of experiences that you're trying to integrate into a civilian life that pretends those experiences never happened. More significantly, your nervous system has been permanently altered by prolonged exposure to life-threatening stress. Your startle response is hyperactive, your threat detection systems are oversensitive, and your ability to distinguish between actual dangers and imaginary dangers has been compromised by 2 years of living in an environment where everything was potentially dangerous. The psychological consequences are more subtle but more pervasive than the physical consequences. Your understanding of human nature has been fundamentally altered by witnessing what people do to each other when social constraints are removed and survival is at stake. This knowledge can't be unknown, and it affects every subsequent social interaction. Your sense of meaning and purpose has been disrupted by participating in an enterprise that consumed enormous resources in human lives to achieve objectives that seem pointless in retrospect. The gap between the stated purposes of the war and the actual experience of fighting it creates a cynicism that affects your ability to believe in any large-scale human enterprise. Your relationship with death has been changed by prolonged exposure to random, violent death of people you cared about. Death is no longer an abstract concept that happens to other people at some point in the distant future. It's an immediate possibility that could happen to anyone at any time for no meaningful reason. Society's response to returning veterans creates additional problems that compound the psychological difficulties of readjustment. The heroic mythology that civilians use to understand war service doesn't match the reality of combat experience, creating pressure to either lie about your experiences or be dismissed as unpatriotic for telling the truth. The expectation that veterans should be grateful for the opportunity to serve creates guilt and confusion for people whose primary feeling about military service is relief that they survived it. The assumption that time heals all wounds creates impatience with veterans who don't recover according to civilian expectations and timelines. On Chapter 44, the generational impact when trauma becomes inheritance. The long-term consequences of combat experience extend beyond the individual veterans to affect their families, communities, and future generations in ways that won't be fully understood for decades. Veterans' families bear the indirect costs of combat trauma through living with people who have been fundamentally changed by experiences they can't understand or share. Children of combat veterans grow up in households where normal family interactions are filtered through one parent's combat-related psychological difficulties. They learn to navigate around their father's startle responses, accommodate his sleep problems, and avoid triggering his anger or withdrawal. These children develop their own coping strategies for living with someone who is psychologically present but emotionally unavailable, physically safe, but psychologically dangerous to approach. Spouses of combat veterans face the challenge of maintaining intimate relationships with people who have been trained to suppress emotional responses and maintain psychological distance for survival purposes. Communities that receive large numbers of returning veterans experience social disruption that affects everyone, not just the veterans and their immediate families. Employment patterns change as large numbers of men with similar psychological profiles and limited civilian job skills enter the workforce simultaneously. Social institutions, churches, civic organizations, local government have to adapt to serve populations with needs they weren't designed to address. Crime patterns change as men trained in violence and accustomed to solving problems through direct action encounter civilian problems that don't respond to military solutions. The cultural impact of mass combat trauma affects society's understanding of war, violence, and human nature for generations. Literature, art, and popular culture begin to reflect the reality of industrial warfare rather than the mythology of heroic warfare. This creates a cultural shift towards cynicism about authority, skepticism about stated political objectives, and awareness of the gap between official narratives and lived reality. Political discourse changes as voters who have direct experience with the costs of war become less susceptible to political rhetoric about easy military solutions to complex problems. Chapter 45, the historical perspective, looking back from the future. From the perspective of the 21st century, World War I represents a turning point in human history when industrial technology was applied to warfare with consequences that nobody anticipated and nobody was prepared to handle. The war accelerated technological development in ways that changed not just military affairs, but civilian life, creating innovations in medicine, engineering, communications, and manufacturing that had peacetime applications. But these technological advances came at enormous human cost, and they created precedents for applying industrial methods to the destruction of human life that would be repeated and expanded in subsequent conflicts. The lesson that technology could be used to kill people more efficiently was learned by everyone who participated in the war, including people who would later use that knowledge for purposes that had nothing to do with military objectives. The war destroyed 4 empires and created dozens of new countries, redrawing the political map of Europe and the Middle East in ways that created new conflicts, while failing to resolve the conflicts that caused the original war. The political settlement after the war satisfied nobody and created conditions that led directly to World War II, which was larger, more destructive, and involved even more systematic application of industrial methods to the destruction of human life. The war accelerated social changes that had been developing gradually: the expansion of women's roles in society, the decline of traditional class structures, and the growth of government involvement in civilian life. These changes would probably have occurred eventually without the war, but the war compressed them into a few years and made them irreversible by creating conditions that required new approaches to social organization. Perhaps most importantly, the war changed society's understanding of human psychology and the effects of trauma on mental health. The scale of psychological casualties from the war forced military and civilian authorities to acknowledge that mental health problems were real medical conditions rather than moral failures or character weaknesses. This recognition led to the development of new approaches to treating psychological trauma, though these approaches wouldn't be fully developed until after several more wars had produced additional millions of psychological casualties. Final chapter, the modern perspective, why you wouldn't survive. So here we are, back where we started, the question of whether a modern person could survive the trenches of World War I. After 45 chapters of exploring what that experience actually involved, I think the answer is clear. Probably not, and not for the reasons you might think. Yes, modern humans are physically less prepared for the rigors of trench warfare than people from 1916. We're less accustomed to physical hardship, manual labor, and uncomfortable living conditions. We're more dependent on technology, more accustomed to comfort, and less experienced with the kind of improvisation and resourcefulness that trench life required. But physical adaptation isn't the primary challenge. Humans are remarkably adaptable creatures, and most of us could probably learn to function in terrible physical conditions if we had to. The real challenge is psychological, and it's not just about being tough enough to handle stress and danger. Modern life has trained us to expect problems to have solutions, to believe that situations can be improved through effort and intelligence, and to assume that suffering is temporary and meaningful. Trench warfare was characterized by problems that had no solutions, situations that couldn't be improved regardless of effort or intelligence, and suffering that was permanent and meaningless. Your modern psychological equipment, your assumptions about how the world works, your strategies for coping with difficulty, your expectations about human behavior wouldn't just be inadequate for trench warfare. It would be counterproductive. Perhaps most importantly, modern humans are used to having choices about our social relationships, our living conditions, and our daily activities. Trench warfare involved no choices about anything that mattered. You lived where you were told to live, with people you didn't choose, doing work you didn't want to do, for purposes you couldn't control, for a duration that was determined by other people. Modern psychology is built around the assumption of personal agency, the belief that you can influence your circumstances through your decisions and actions. Trench warfare was designed to eliminate personal agency as completely as possible. Finally, modern humans are used to finding or creating meaning in our experiences. We expect our suffering to serve some purpose, our work to contribute to some goal, and our sacrifices to advance some cause. The soldiers of World War I started with these same expectations, but trench warfare destroyed them. The war had no clear objectives, achieved no meaningful goals, and served no purpose that justified its costs. Learning to function without meaning, without agency, without choices, and without hope of improvement is probably beyond the psychological capabilities of people who have been raised to expect all of these things as basic features of human existence. So the question isn't really whether you could survive the physical hardships of trench warfare, though those were extreme. The question is whether you could survive the complete elimination of everything that makes modern life psychologically tolerable: choice, agency, comfort, safety, meaning, and hope. Could you adapt to living in conditions where death is random, suffering is constant, improvement is impossible, and the only goal is to survive until tomorrow so you can try to survive the day after that? Could you maintain your humanity in an environment designed to reduce human beings to military equipment? Could you form meaningful relationships with people while knowing that most of them will probably die in horrible ways and there's nothing you can do to prevent it? Could you follow orders that you know will get people killed, including possibly yourself, in service of objectives that make no rational sense? Could you kill other people who are exactly like you, in exactly the same situation, fighting for exactly the same reasons? These aren't questions about physical strength or mental toughness. These are questions about the fundamental structure of human psychology, and whether the psychological equipment that serves us well in modern life could function at all in the extreme conditions of industrial warfare. Before we finish, I want you to do something for me. Look around wherever you're watching this. Look at your comfortable chair, your climate-controlled room, your electronic devices, your access to clean water and safe food and medical care. Think about the fact that you can go to sleep tonight without wondering if you'll wake up tomorrow. Think about the fact that you can make plans for next week, next month, next year with reasonable confidence that you'll be alive to carry them out. Think about the fact that when you're hungry, you can eat. When you're thirsty, you can drink. When you're cold, you can get warm. When you're sick, you can get medical care. When you're lonely, you can connect with other people. These aren't luxuries. These aren't special privileges that only wealthy people enjoy. These are basic features of modern life that would have seemed like impossible dreams to soldiers in the trenches of World War I. The next time you're stuck in traffic, remember that you're sitting in a climate-controlled vehicle, listening to music of your choice, probably heading somewhere you want to go or somewhere that serves a purpose you understand. The next time you complain about your job, remember that you chose that job, you can quit that job, and you're probably not going to die doing that job. The next time you're bored, remember that boredom is a luxury that requires safety, security, and the absence of immediate threats to your survival. The next time you're stressed about something, remember that your stress is probably about something that won't kill you, something that you have some control over, and something that will eventually be resolved one way or another. We owe something to the men who fought in the trenches of World War I, and that debt isn't paid by calling them heroes or thanking them for their service. We pay that debt by remembering what they actually experienced, not the sanitized version that makes us feel better about ourselves. We pay that debt by understanding the real costs of war, not the idealized version that makes war seem like a reasonable solution to political problems. We pay that debt by appreciating the world they helped create through their suffering, even if that world isn't perfect, and even if their suffering wasn't voluntary or meaningful in the ways they hoped it would be. So here's my final thought for you to take away from this exploration of why a modern human wouldn't survive the trenches of World War I. You wouldn't survive, not because you're weak or soft or insufficiently patriotic, but because you're human, and humans aren't designed to function in the conditions that industrial warfare creates. The men who did survive didn't survive because they were better people or stronger people or more moral people than you. They survived because they were forced to adapt to conditions that no human being should have to adapt to. And they paid prices for that adaptation that affected them for the rest of their lives. Their survival was a testament to human adaptability under extreme conditions, but it was also evidence of what human adaptability costs when it's pushed beyond reasonable limits. The fact that you probably couldn't survive what they survived isn't a criticism of you. It's a criticism of a world that created conditions where such survival was necessary.